role in data privacy. My name is Mary Cummins. I'm moderating this session. So before we begin, I wanted to let everyone know there's a time for questions at the end of the session. So feel free to save your questions till then. Otherwise, if you'd like to chat a question, put a question in the chat during the session, that's fine. I'll make a note of it. And we will answer questions at the end. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Stephen Way. He is the Chief Information Officer and IT Director at the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences.
Well, thank you, Mary, for the introduction. We're going to keep the introductions short and sweet, so I do appreciate that. I'm hoping everyone sees the full screen and not my presentation slide. Okay, good. So the presentation is out there online somewhere if you want access to this. I also want to thank Mary and Sarah and so many others, owls online, for setting up this conference. I think you have done another great job on getting this done, and this is such a great resource for the well-being of all IT staff on campus. So thank you for your efforts. They're greatly appreciated by folks like me. So why is the guy that does, IT management of cow data and plant data and pig data and bird data, why is he talking about data privacy, right? So, do cows have identities besides the ones that type? Not so much. However, the reason I might be talking about this is my previous 20 years in cybersecurity, coupled with the education I've been doing the last couple of years around getting a degree in legal studies with an emphasis of cybersecurity and data privacy. However, are those the same things, cybersecurity and data privacy? Not so much. They're definitely intertwined. They're heavily related, but data privacy goes beyond cybersecurity. Our role in IT is really to have a greater understanding of data privacy, what our organizational role, be it UW-Madison or any other organization, may have regarding privacy, and then what, as IT staff or employees or professionals, do we have for maintaining data in a private manner. So when we talk about privacy, we're talking about individuals. When we talk about cybersecurity, we're talking about the mission of an organization. So the privacy of an individual, they have certain expectations based on values and norms of a society that are also balanced against the safety precautions of that society. We gave up some of our privacies after the events of 9/11 based on the safety and security needs of our communities and our nation. So that's an example of that balance. So Daniel Salevo is one of the national experts in this space, and I highly suggest you go out and read some of his work. I have links at the end of the presentation to his and some other works in the area of data privacy. He talks about 4 tenets of data privacy, and I've rebranded these into the anatomy of a data privacy breach. So 4 things between information collection, processing, dissemination, and then the potential invasion to that individual. So we typically have 2 people in this equation. We have the data subject, the person who's providing either intentionally or unintentionally information about themselves to a data holder, someone like UW-Madison, or Meta, or Twitter, or LinkedIn, or healthcare providers, or so many other parties that we entrust our information with. They either provide it based on filling out a form or responding to questions or interviews or those sorts of things. Occasionally, it's also observed, and this is probably the space from an IT perspective that we see the most, is we observe behavior based on the person's interactions through an IT device to the data. So we collect things like IP address and MAC address and time of authentication, usernames and access points and those sorts of things. So we observe their behavior within our systems for legitimate business purposes. It's not a bad thing, but we do it so we can help resolve potential issues, so we can understand what the future needs may be for this group of stakeholders. So then there's the processing of that data by the data holder. We aggregate all this data. We might collect it from the subject, from their observed behavior, or even from third parties. We may collect or purchase data from these third parties to be able to further inform us on what services or other things we need. A good example of third-party provided data focuses on, I don't know if it's a current practice or not, but we used to get an upload from the organization that does ACT and SAT scores. We would get a data dump several times a year from these organizations into our student information system that would tell us information about these students and what their scores were. The business purpose of that was twofold. First one was, hey, who should we be actively recruiting based on the results of those tests? And two, to validate when some Yahoo like me may claim to get a whatever score on the test. Now we have that record go back and validate that information. So those are usage or information processing aspects of using that third-party provided data. Other information processing things are around identification, so matching an individual to a data set or a activity, monitoring what someone may be doing or how they may be interacting with something or a change in their data. So a monitoring might be those students who go from current student to graduate. So that monitoring then alerts us to change their services for campus. So those are some of those processing things around data. Now we cross that border into the potential harms to that data subject. So hopefully those are the first two of collection and processing are helping those individuals and the data holder do the things that need to be done to benefit both stakeholders. Now dissemination is when things can go awry. So we have blackmail and breach of confidentiality, disclosure, exposure. One of my more interesting stories on disclosure exposure is with Target. Several years ago, there was a young lady who created a baby registry for Target, and she filled out a bunch of information about herself, like her address, her name, and her age, and those sorts of things, because she wanted to be able to start building that registry to be able to share to people as her pregnancy continued. However, Target then said, hey, we could be doing more direct marketing to that individual. So they sent her a postcard congratulating her on her life-changing event and saying what services they offered and wishing her well and giving her a discount. When her dad went out to get the mail that day and saw the postcard that was addressed to his daughter, who was 17 at the time, that's how he found out his daughter was pregnant. So that's where that invasion or that intrusion of privacy really took place, where Target kind of crossed that line of using the data to provide the service of having a baby registry, which makes some money, to further try to make the money, right? By saying, here are some more things that you can do. In the meantime, breaking that trust between the daughter and potentially breaking the trust between the daughter and her parents. Other two items to mention is appropriation, which is often associated with identity theft. So if someone gains access to someone's personally identifiable data, they may be able to open credit or redirect finances or those sorts of things, which again is that invasion piece. Or distortion, where the data is used in isolation to make a decision about that individual that may or may not appropriately reflect the facts of that data subject in making that decision, such as enrollment or giving someone a line of credit or a credit card or other services. Those sorts of information dissemination events leads to that invasion of privacy, which is an intrusion for that stakeholder, for that individual, and breaks their trust with that organization, with the government, with others, that may deter them from doing other things. So then they have this decisional interference of infecting their judgment to be able to make reasonable decisions based on what one or more organizations have done. So in jumping ahead a little bit, this is kind of a busy slide, and I don't want to spend too much time. You can kind of take this away. These are those additional things that talk about the harms of data or the causes of data dissemination. And one I want to really call out here is a secondary use. So we may collect data for a specific use case. So it's that secondary use of the data that gets us in trouble quite a bit. So if we're asked, oh, hey, I know we collect data about how many times a student goes to the recreational facility, to the athletic center. I want to be able to use that to inform health insurance of something. It's that secondary use that's not appropriate, because those students who are using our recreational centers do not intend for that information to be used for an insurance provider. So keeping those two things separate. And I think our responsibility is asking the question, is this an appropriate use? Have we been given approval for this process? So I think that's a really key attribute, is that secondary use of data beyond the original intent of the collection and management of that data. Identification is the other thing worth calling out here. Is quite often we think we need to attribute every record to an individual, whereas we're really trying to identify behaviors or patterns. Do we really need to know that Stefan logged in I'll pick on myself, that I failed to log in 97 times from this URL when I was really, entering my username and password wrong? Or does that just need to be flagged for someone to say, hey, is our user interface appropriate? Why was this person struggling? So there's certain things we can do that doesn't call out the individual, but can call out the events that may inform us of potential need for change. Our Constitution does not specifically state a right to privacy. And actually that's covered in Amendment 9 that says, hey, not everything is in this document, in this Bill of Rights. However, what our Supreme Court has done over the last couple centuries, or last century or so, couple centuries, has been to really establish that privacy is built into our Constitution through these amendments. The one worth calling out from an IPT perspective is that on search and seizure. So search and seizure was really along the lines of being stopped and asked to provide information about yourself, or allowing yourself to be searched, or your home to be searched without additional authority from the government, or validation that this is an activity that should be done for safety and security. Those sorts of protections have moved from the physical space into the virtual space with things like cell phones or application logs or those sorts of things. And so this is really where it's important and incumbent to us as IT professionals, is just not to hand data over to someone and say, hey, I need this for this safety security purpose. It's actually a result of the Patriot Act, is that when someone comes to us, it really needs to come through legal affairs to say, yes, there is a need to collect this data for this reason. There needs to be reasonable or just cause to get access to that. It's not up to us as IT professionals to provide that directly without that intermediary, such as our legal affairs office. So what are the privacy responsibilities of an organization like UW-Madison or anywhere else? And that's really what is being driven by the Federal Trade Commission or other frameworks, is to establish a data privacy program. And a program is several components, and I've distilled it down into the considering of these 4 points. The first point is having a single person or organization accountable and responsible for data privacy. This person is actually working on behest of the individuals whose data we're managing. They're not working at behest of the organization. At least that's not their focus. Their focus is serving as that agent to say, this is how we're going to protect the privacy of the information. This is the expectations that if you give us your data that you should have of how we're going to use and manage your data, and establish and manage that program. This person should be part of the reviewing process of sharing of any requested share data. So if an organization comes in and wants our student records for some reason, or what we do with Canvas and that group, what we share back should be reviewed from that angle of the students or the faculty and staff or other constituents of the university where we manage their data elements. What are those sharing requests, and how do we ensure that we're not sharing something that may violate someone's privacy, and what can we do to avoid those issues? And finally, lending an ear and a voice to data management plans. So considering privacy from a data management plan in how data is collected, and this is moving into the second element, how data is requested, what is the access requirements to that data, how should it be limited or exposed, what is the limitations of the use of that data, and then how do we educate staff periodically on the appropriate use of that data or the management of that data from a privacy standpoint. So on that, we do have to be careful that we don't have so many educational training type programs where that can be knit into something like our cybersecurity awareness program or other training programs to create an overlap in that space. The next area you'll see in quotes is policy. And the reason I have policy there's a article that I've listed in the slides that discusses a lot about the complexity in the data privacy policies organizations publish, the complexity and the legalese and the time it takes to read it. And I'm not a fan of the term too long didn't read. I think that you lose a certain level of notoriety, a certain level of something when you say too long didn't read. However, we're putting the onus on the data subject to understand how their data is being used instead of putting the onus on the organization to communicate appropriately how we're using their data. So as you hear more about accessibility and user experience, data privacy policies should really be part of that conversation of how are we communicating with our constituents and how we're managing their data. It can't be a long, complex document. Twitter has gamified this apparently. I looked at the other day. It's kind of hokey, to be honest. Another group out of Carnegie Mellon has created basically the equivalent of the nutrition card for data privacy for organizations. So you know how we have our nutritional labels and everything. They've created a label for data privacy, which is simple and more easy to understand, and you can then know that. So think about, I'm wearing a Fitbit, right? So how much data is coming off this thing, going into my phone, going off now to 3 different apps. How can that data potentially be misused, especially if my insurance provider is interested in knowing should they really be insuring me or not? So those sorts of things. And then the last part, which if you've ever heard me talk before about cybersecurity, is to always validate our controls of the program working as designed. So this is that cycle. I did not do my little cycle diagram because that gets old after a while, but are we validating that the controls are working within the laws and regulations, and are we communicating the results to our stakeholders in a way that's meaningful for them to make potential changes? Those changes actually can be reducing how much work we spend in this space. So finally, we'll jump into probably the title of this presentation, right? What is IT's role in data privacy? This is not an all-encompassing list, obviously, but at least it'll make my project management friends happy in recognizing that we must collect the requirements when it comes into data management. So how long do we need data for? What are the regulations around managing that data? How do we store it? How do we encrypt it? What are our responsibilities? What are the threats? What are the risks around that data? Knowing where our personally identified information, PII, is stored is also vital. So we know that we can apply the right set of controls to those areas, and we're not having to implement additional controls where they're not needed. So additionally, maintaining only the data that's needed. So let's remove data that's no longer needed. My cybersecurity friends have spent way too many cycles investigating data that was 10, 15 years old that was inadvertently exposed, often log data that had PII in it. So let's make sure we're cleaning those systems and removing the data where we no longer have a business need for it. The most uninteresting element, sorry, my identity management friends, is the area of access control, but we must maintain that access to the data is granted to only those who have a business need from wherever they need to access it from. Is a trusted network, and again, it depends on the risk. So some of my final thoughts, again, this was a short presentation, definitely not expecting anyone to walk away thinking, hey, I'm an expert now, or Stefan was expert in all this. But some final thoughts to really take away from this is that data privacy is really about protecting the individual. It's not about protecting the organization. But by protecting those individuals, you are protecting the organization. Privacy is a team activity, so this cannot be led or directed solely by IT. This is an activity that the organization needs to buy into, be it UW-Madison, be it any other organization, just like Title IX, just like cybersecurity, just like PCI DSS, just like those things. It's not just an IT activity, it's a organizational activity. There is a risk-based approach. Anyone who's seen me talk over the past 20 years know I talk a lot about risk. Not every control listed in something like the NIST privacy framework has to be checked. It should be reviewed. It should be identified as something that should be considered, but it's definitely not something that, hey, I have to check every one of these. Need to consider it, need to then say, hey, yep, that's appropriate for us, or that's not appropriate for us. Policy evolves over time, so technology changes. So think about what privacy was 20 years ago compared to now. Think about what technology was, all those apps on our phone and what they're doing. In fact, I have an app on my phone called Life 360 that tells my kids and my wife where I'm at and tells me where they're at, tells them how fast I'm driving in my car. All those things would be really interesting to my insurance company, right? Why keep my thermostat app might be really interesting to my utility company. Those things weren't an issue 15, 20 years ago, but evolves over time. Going back to that privacy policy or the statement, it needs to be understandable to the consumer. So I am sharing this set of information with you. What are you going to do with it? That is a question that needs to be answered in a concise manner with that. Finally, cybersecurity is part of the privacy program, but definitely doesn't drive the whole privacy program. I would really lean more to our friends over in the data management office and legal affairs, say, okay, what should we really be doing about privacy on campus? So I know if I was still in the cybersecurity space and someone said, "Oh, Stephanie, you could be the privacy officer," I may say, "No, that I need someone closer to the mission to be that person." So that being said, I have my obligatory slide on laws and standards. You can definitely go out and read more on these. One that's definitely if you do anything with providing services on campus to children's programs, understanding COPA is very, very important in how you collect data. You can't entice a child to provide data to you without consent and so many other things. So that's a really important one. I'm HIPAA'd out as a former HIPAA security officer. It's still important, but there's a lot of avenues here to learn more about. A lot of people keep saying we need a federal law. That will not happen anytime soon, in my opinion. So I think we need to act locally and wait for the global actions to further resolve. Finally, here's a list of 5 readings that I recommend. There's a lot more, but it's definitely a opportunity to go out if you're interested in the space and get a greater understanding than what you've been given in the last 0.5 minutes. So that being said, I'm curious if there's any questions or thoughts or comments.
There is a question from Steve in the chat. I can read that to you, Steph. And I also wanted to let everyone know that Stefan's slides are found on the conference website. So I put a link to those in the chat if you want to check those out. Yeah, so the question from Steve is, should we address privacy by adopting a policy of opt-in for sharing or secondary use, even if the law does not require that?
So I'm not a lawyer, but I'm going to use their answer and I'm going to say it depends. So opt-in is really about, do they want or need the services of UW-Madison? So I think it depends on the service you're offering. If you're offering them the service of getting a degree from UW-Madison, there's not an element of opt-in that's global. So that's that balance of informing them, hey, we need this information about you to get you enrolled, to get you matriculated through the system, and to then validate that you've successfully completed your degree. And that isn't a opt-in in providing that service. Now, if it's a service that is, Thursday night chess club at the Union, that may be different from an opt-in, opt-out standpoint. So it kind of depends on the service that's being answered or being addressed. Did I wiggle out of that okay, Dave?
Yeah. I think, a lot of it is just thinking, okay, students will understand when they say, hey, you're asking for these sorts of information that, that it's needed to, to make the thing work, right? But it's that principle of surprise when suddenly they start getting solicitations from other areas because we took the data we collected and we, shared it with, lots of people they didn't know, via Salesforce, even if they're internal people, right? Suddenly the chess club contacts them and says, hey, we crawled, Salesforce and thought, people who also liked this, like chess club as well, then it starts getting creepy. So I'm just wondering if that's one where, in there we say, hey, there's a minimum set of things they have to supply, and we're not going to push that unless they click boxes that say, hey, let me know about cool UW-Madison things, but please don't tell my insurance provider.
I think you nailed that, Steve. I think you hit it on the head with the, hey, I want to opt into these additional things. Here are the core requirements to be part of our community, if you will. And it should be really limited. I will say one of the things that Jason Persane and I have done in CALS, based on a question about the IT security tools, some of the faculty were questioning about opting out from those based on the data that was collected. So we identified why we collect the data, why we use that data, how we won't use that data, and then provided that back. And they're like, okay, that makes sense. So what they were concerned with is that someone like me could go in and look at their research. No, I can't. I would need to take additional steps to get that far. Not really that interested in some of those research elements, and nor would I understand what they're doing. However, I think I needed to address their concern that their potentially proprietary information could be misused or misdirected. And so I think that's where you're getting at, Steve, is that, we need to be mindful when we tell people what we're doing, that's what we're doing with that. So Cool. How are we doing on time, Mary?
It is 3:45. There's one more question in the chat if you want to take a minute to answer it. Up to you. It's from Dave. How do we change the culture from we have the data and can use it to we only have the data for a specific purpose? We cannot use it for anything else.
Oh, Dave. That's actually it's a cultural question, and we can't intentionally change culture. We can evolve culture by putting the right types of values and norms out front and demonstrate why it's beneficial for those values and norms. And that has to be done through a leadership perspective. So I think it's using our experience. And Dave, you've been a great partner with me over the years in this, in kind of weighing the benefits of doing something and not doing something, and where is that sweet spot, and how do we then move that forward? And once we find that sweet spot, then that's when leadership is willing to act and say, yes, we can support that. And so I think it's us having those conversations on what are the right things to do with this data. If we're being asked to provide data, let's say to, you know, trying to think of a good example, organization, the CDC. So we're asked to provide certain information to the CDC by UW-Madison, that we make sure that that's really what the university intends, and we help drive the right decision maker to that. So short answer is find the right decision makers will change the culture.
All right, I'm gonna just wrap this up from a moderator standpoint. If more people want to stay behind and Stefan, if you have time, you can stay in this meeting longer. But I just thank you, Stefan, for this presentation. It was very interesting. And thanks for all the participants for attending. 4 o'clock, there is the IT community session. If you'd like to attend that, you'll be learning about different groups on campus, also an opportunity to network. Otherwise, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., we kick off with the IT awards ceremony. You don't want to miss that one. All right, well, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Be well.